welcome to this week's look at the Scriptures. For the last 23 weeks, we have been considering as the Gospel that of Matthew, and today, or this weekend, brings to an end our look at Matthew's story. And this weekend, we celebrate a feast in honor of Jesus as the King, or Christ the King Sunday, or in some traditions known as the Reign of Christ Sunday. The scripture readings come from the prophet Ezekiel, chapter 34, verses 11, 12, 15, and 17. From the letter of Paul, the first letter of Paul to the Corinthians in chapter 15, a few verses from there. And finally, the Matthew Gospel is chapter 25, verses 31 to 46. So this week, we celebrate a feast, and therefore, for example, the color of the vestments will change to white or gold if you happen to have them, which we don't. In 1925, the then Pope, Pius XI, looking at what was happening in the world, that was in the world of his time, the First World War had shortly ended, crises were going on again in Europe, somewhat not in the United States. It would be only 4 years later that the Great Depression would take place. But the Pope felt that Jesus was being pushed out of the both public and private life. And so he thought to shed some light into a world that was spinning in the darkness of the time, that a darkness that the Pope thought was characterized by violence and selfishness, that therefore a feast honoring Jesus as truly the leader, truly the King, would be appropriate. And this feast was celebrated on the Sunday preceding the celebration of All Saints. So it would be, therefore, the last Sunday of October. And that's where originally it was observed. The idea being Jesus is the King, and then we would celebrate all of those who had been victorious, the saints, and then also those who were on the road to the kingdom, the holy souls in purgatory. Well, that all changed as a result of the Second Vatican Council, which rearranged the liturgical year that we now have and decided that a fitting end to the liturgical year would be the celebration of Christ the King. And so that's why now it's observed on the last Sunday of the liturgical year. And all of that's a little bit of history, just to kind of put it into perspective. The gospel for this week is known as the Great Judgment. It is a characteristic episode unique to the gospel tradition of Matthew, and in some ways reflects what Matthew has been looking at in the course of his story of Jesus. Now, this episode, which is known as the judgment scene, you would be probably quite familiar with. We won't read it all. But basically, it pictures now the Son of Man coming in glory to judge. And here we will talk a little bit about some differing viewpoints about what exactly the group who is being judged, but at least coming at the end to make judgment on a group of people. We will look, is it all the people of the world, or is it only Christians who have done well or haven't done well? And you remember that the judgment seat is that it begins by Jesus separating the goats and the sheep, or the sheep and the goats, putting the sheep on the right hand, goats on the left hand. And then a series of, I was hungry and you gave me to eat, I was thirsty and you gave me to drink, etc. will go down. And the group who are in one position will say, but when did we see this? And Jesus will say, well, when you gave it to one of these, the least of my brethren, you gave it to me. So there's actually going to be 4 times that the same thing is said. The 4th time, it's a little more abbreviated. Having done, these were the things that needed to be done. These were the ones who did it. These were the things that needed to be done. These were the things that were not done. So on the other hand, you will get the same story or list of items. So that's the gist of this great judgment. Now, in some ways, there are different ways to look at this. Remember, what we're looking at basically here is the way in which the Matthean tradition kind of puts things together. It may or may not be exactly the way in which we homilize that on Sunday, but or the weekend, but certainly what I'm interested in is that we kind of get a feel for what the Matthean gospel has been done or doing. So, the Son of Man, again, this is a unique term that is used in a couple of places in the synoptic tradition. Son of Man goes back to the book of Daniel, as I think I've mentioned before, in which there is a vision picturing that there will come one riding on the clouds like the Son of Man. Now, what the New Testament writers do is to take the term Son of Man, which could have been small s, Son of Man, or Son of Humanity, and capitalize it. Son, S-O-N, capital, of man, capital M-A-N, and thus particularly applied to Jesus. This is the way in which the New Testament writer here and also in the book of Revelation tends to understand that term. So it's an interesting term, how it is used by the New Testament writers and applies it specifically to Jesus and to the coming of Jesus in glory. So in the end, all the nations will be assembled together and this division takes place. Now, we separate the sheep on the right hand and the goats on the left hand. Now, some of you might smile and say, well, what's this sheeping and goating bit, and why are they divided as such? Now, I don't want to get in any trouble with left-handed persons, but the preference here is that if you are on the right hand, you're on the side of goodness. If you're on the left hand, you're not so good, okay? In fact, in Latin, the word for right hand is dexterous, and the word for left hand is sinistra. So you can almost get the English reading that you might not want to be on that side. So the sheep were, of course, very important in the culture of the time, as were goats, by the way. And often what would happen is when the sheep and goats were kind of herded together, you needed to come a point where you would separate them. So, for example, at night, often the goats were put into a kind of place where it was warmer, because the goats could not take cold as well as the sheep, so they were outside. That's one of the reasons. There's a lot of, you have to kind of be familiar with this whole culture, I suppose, to appreciate this. But symbolically, the sheep symbolized honor, virility, and strength. Even though they tended to be more dependent, those were the qualities that were characterizing the idea of sheep. On the other hand, goats were considered to be very vivacious animals. For example, goats were allowed, I don't know how they figured this out, to access the females of other goats. So there was even this kind of going on. So there was a sexual difficulty here. And shameful behavior were often associated with goats. And just to irritate you ladies a little bit more, goats were also associated with women and the devil. So you can see when this division took place, the hearers said, oh, all right, we kind of see how that's going to work out or shouldn't work out. Also, from a commercial sense, sheep were much more valuable than goats. Sheep, of course, had a number of other items that they could, the wool, of course, and things like that made them important. So all of that's a little background as to this idea of separating into the two categories. Now, why is this characteristic of the Matthean gospel? Remember, as we've gone along, and in fact over the last couple of weeks in the parables that Jesus was telling, you remember that there was the constant message was, be watchful, be ready. Remember, now there were three parables. There was the wicked servant. Remember, I don't know that you might remember that one, but the wicked servant was put in charge of things, the steward, and when one of them kind of kept things in good order while the master was away, the other one said, oh, the master's taking his time and he's not going to be coming, and then he did all kinds of unnice things, so English word for that, to others, okay? Then this was followed, you remember, by the maidens, the wise maiden and the foolish maiden. And then last time between the lazy steward and the enterprising stewards. Remember the talents that were given to them and how they used them. So Matthew has been setting up this dichotomy between those who remained loyal and faithful and observant and those who unfortunately did not. And so on one side you had those who failed to be ready, on the other side you had those who succeeded in being ready. So now that's a little bit of a background to see that this idea of dividing has been a characteristic of the Matthean tradition. In fact, earlier on in other sections of the gospel, and go back and see this, that the words had been given that those who remain loyal and faithful will be rewarded, and those who do not will be, and one of the phrases that occasionally is used by Matthew, will be cast out into the darkness. And don't you like the words from last week, whether it will be the grinding of teeth? If you really want to get an image, try listening to grinded teeth, or it's like scratching your hand on the old blackboard, which goes right through you. So Matthew has used kind of powerful images as he is getting ready now for this great judgment scene. So here we are now. The nations are gathered before the throne, and Jesus is the one who is going to merit out now the long-awaited sorting of good and evil. Remember earlier on, let the weeds grow with the wheat. Well, now we got to separate the weed from the wheat. Let the bad fish go with the rest. Now we're going to separate them from the group. So all of this is, I want to say, a characteristic of the Matthean gospel. Maybe it's not true of all the rest of each of the other ones. What will be at stake here, as we listen now to the judgment that is given, is mercy. This is a quality that has been very important in the stories that Matthew has been telling, and now, appropriately, this becomes the climatic moment. I mentioned this just in passing, that this is the last episode now before Jesus enters into his suffering and death. See, so in a way, I would suggest it bookends the whole message of Jesus as the teacher, the great prophet of the new Israel. Remember, when I say bookend, if you go back to the beginning in chapter 5 of Jesus' mission, began with the famous Sermon on the Mount, in which, and we heard this just a couple weeks ago on the Feast of All Saints, the famous Beatitudes. Well, now, if you look at what the Beatitudes say, and if you look at what the judgment is here in this particular scene, you can see why I call it a bookend. In other words, they're very similar. And all of the material in between, for all of the chapters now, from 5 leading up to this, has been part of the message of the kingdom that Jesus has been called to teach. Remember, he's proclaimed as the great teacher, the new Moses, and also the new prophet, as Moses also was a prophet. And so a very strong figure, just in summarizing things from the Matthean tradition, a very strong figure in Matthew's gospel is that of Moses giving the law. Jesus, of course, gives the law. Never, and this is always very important, and I mentioned this a few times, never negating the law, saying, no, the law no longer holds. That is the Torah, the law of Israel, but rather bringing it to fulfillment, or bringing it to a new level, we would say, a deeper meaning. See, so there's great appreciation on the part of the Matthean writer for the tradition of Israel, but sees in the person and teaching of Jesus something richer, something fuller. And that too now comes to the climax here in this famous scene. So all of that is background, but one of the issues that is currently been raised, when I say this, the traditional background is that all the nations are gathered before the throne, and now Jesus is pictured as making a judgment. So if it's all the nations, all the peoples, then did they all know Jesus? Did they all know the gospel message? Are they simply being, or importantly, being judged on how well they dealt with their neighbor? Now notice, which is a very strong biblical image, we're concerned about the poor, the needy, the helpless, those who were the struggling, or as Matthew sometimes calls them, the little ones, the ones who are outside of the perimeter of having much to say about how things go in their lives. And that, of course, is an interesting characteristic of what the prophet was to be. The prophet would be a spokesperson for those who were unable publicly to express their needs or to express their concerns. So what are the deeds by which they are judged here? Well, sharing bread with the hungry, sheltering the oppressed and the homeless, clothing the naked, giving drink to the thirsty, sending widows away empty-handed, destroying the resources of orphans. So those who did that were now to be healed. The only thing that is different here is visiting those who are imprisoned. Now that was something that is unique to the Matthean story, and that's what opens the door to a question about who exactly are those who are gathered before the throne for judgment. Because who would be those who would be imprisoned that would be the concern here of Jesus, if not those who were preaching or teaching the message of Jesus and ran against opposition and were put in prison, literally, okay? And so visiting the imprisonment here does not mean going to visit those who were considered to be murderers or etc. Not that it couldn't be, but that does not seem to be the initial intent here. Namely, it's visiting those fellow Christians who were caught up by others who didn't like this and literally imprisoned. That therefore raises the question, is the group who was gathered before the throne simply all of the nations, which is, by the way, the traditional way in which this is interpreted? And I'm not sure that this isn't one of the better ways throughout the centuries in which this particular judgment scene has been seen. But a different viewpoint, one that some scholars now look at, is to say that the group who are gathered are the Gentiles who accepted the teaching of Jesus and those who did not. And therefore, it is a much more particular group who are gathered at the foot at the thrones of the king. The more inclusive, see, would have been everybody. So this new one, which we, I suppose, would call a more particular or particularistic viewpoint, says that this is a separation for judgment by Gentiles who have been taught to respect Israel. Now, whether or not you like this, I don't, but it is interesting because that would make sense from one point of view, that as long as you did it to the least of these, my brothers, you did it to me. So this viewpoint says you have the Gentiles and the Christians. The more traditional viewpoint says all humanity, that is, all the nations and all the people who are in distress of some kind. So you can see that there is a little bit of, just as a kind of biblical look here, discussion as to exactly who the group of people are. And the reason why, as I mentioned, this alternative viewpoint is that it is Gentiles and Christians is based on the fact of the visiting the imprisoned. So it takes one of those ideas that are mentioned and says it doesn't make sense if it's all the nations. I suppose some could stretch that out, but that's the viewpoint that they have. And so those who would be imprisoned would be missionaries. And to go to the very end of Matthew's gospel, just to kind of see how all of this fits together, Matthew's gospel pictures Jesus as talking to the disciples and saying, go out into the whole world, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, so that the mission is given to fellow Christians to become missionaries. And therefore, they would be the ones who would be praised here. They would be the ones who would be sitting, if you want, on the right hand of the Father, rather than on the left hand. Acts of mercy, however, regardless, I suppose, of which position you take, is very important to notice here. So there's a lot, and just another quick point. It is pictured as sheep connected with the image of shepherd. Now, I think I've mentioned a number of times, and Matthew again is very careful about this, and that in the scripture, shepherd is always considered to be an important image, sometimes of individuals, but even of God. And there's one point where God is kind of disturbed with the leadership of Israel and says, you're not taking care of the sheep. Now, I smile a little bit whether we want to be called sheep, but keep in mind, sheep are honorable, and that will be working all right here. I myself, says God, will take over the job of being shepherd. And that, of course, also plays into this picture. But God is pictured as the shepherd of Israel. And remember, at a certain point, again, trying to draw together a couple lines or thoughts of the Matthean Gospel, where Jesus is pictured as saying that they are like sheep without a shepherd. and I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be dispersed. Or in the parable, one of the parables, go, says Jesus, and seek out the lost sheep of the house of Israel. There is a certain sense in which it seems that in this gospel it is to Israel that the message of Jesus is given. But by the time that Matthew's gospel is written, we know that a number of Gentiles, that is, non-Jews, have also embraced the Christian message. So that would be the kind of gist, if you want, of this final scene, in which preparedness must always be part of the story, putting together the parables we have heard, and response to the poor, to the needy, is always what is most important. And that would have been true not only for the Matthean community, but also for all who accept Jesus' message. First reading comes from the book of the prophet Ezekiel, who writes his message. And this is why, again, it's a sort of an appropriate first reading for this day, where the prophet is writing after the fall of Jerusalem, that is, when the temple of Solomon had been destroyed in the year 587 before the common time. And the prophet is concerned that human rulers of Israel had failed miserably, and that God, and this is what I mentioned a couple minutes ago, will now personally look after the sheep. Well, that also was a popular image in the prophet Jeremiah. They operated approximately in the same period of time. For God had promised that he would always remain faithful to the covenant with David, that was a hereditary kingship, and that God had chosen the Israelite people and had given them the land, and that God had resided in the temple in Jerusalem and would protect it, and now it had been destroyed. Was God, therefore, not powerful? That the temple had been destroyed? Well, here Ezekiel now says, but let's look forward to a new temple and a new time. And in that sense, by the way, the response verse for this psalm for this Sunday is also the 23rd Psalm, pretty much familiar with everyone. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. So when we look at the king image, if you want, that emerges very strongly from the Matthean tradition, it is Jesus, the shepherd king, who will continue to exercise his concern and care for all. In conclusion, with the idea that all the nations are gathered before the throne of Jesus, there is, of course, we don't have time to go into this, but the thought, well, if all the nations are gathered, they didn't all know Jesus. Are they all going to be saved? And is the basis for entering into the kingdom how well one dealt with the poor, with the needy, with those who were, as I say, on the outskirts? That could be an interesting question that those who study religion today might ask. What about those in other religious traditions? Are they excluded because they did not have the opportunity to hear about Jesus? That, of course, has been a kind of theological question, one that might be a little bit beyond the thinking of the gospel writer here, but nevertheless, perhaps one to look at. Well, this now brings to a conclusion, as I mentioned at the beginning of our look at the gospel tradition of Matthew. The longer of one of the, not the longest, but one of the longest of the Gospels, and certainly again in conclusion, one in which powerful images of Jesus are the new Moses, the great prophet, and the great teacher. As we have seen throughout this Gospel, Jesus does a lot of teaching, not a lot of action. When we come next time and begin to look at the Gospel according to Mark, we will see that he is much more active than he is in the Matthean tradition. I hope this has given a little bit of insight, and perhaps looking at a kind of popular commentary on Matthew's gospel might help, again, put the whole of his work into perspective and give us a deeper and a wonderful appreciation of this work, in which, for a Jewish Christian community, the writer presents Jesus as offering hope, promise to all who remain loyal to the gospel message. Thank you, and happy Christ the King week.